John Brennan served in national security roles for decades, most recently director of the Central Intelligence Agency in the Obama administration, and he joins me now. What's your reaction to this?
Well, the saga of Mike Flynn is an unfortunate, sad tale of two men. One was a military officer who honorably served for over 30 years, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, and rose to the rank of three-star general. The other is a civilian, Mike Flynn, who unfortunately, I think, fell under the sway of some unfortunate influences and decided to opt for cutting corners and forgetting the obligations that he had when he was a military officer in terms of honesty and integrity and making sure that he lives up to those principles and values that really are supposed to be part of the DNA of any military officer. And unfortunately, the pardon now that's been granted to Mike Flynn, given that the criminal violations that he was convicted of really are intertwined with Donald Trump's behavior and his activities, I think it really does suggest very strongly that there was corrupt intent there on the part of Donald Trump. And I think it's going to further blemish, I think, both of their reputations in the future.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, what Michael Flynn pleaded to was lying to the FBI. But that was, as often happens in pleas, right? Prosecutors have things they could charge you with. They choose not to. You plead to something relatively minor in the face of that as part of the bargaining for your cooperation. The thing that they pretty clearly could have charged him with and didn't was being an unregistered foreign agent of the government of Turkey to the tune of $600,000 while working on a campaign in transition and not disclosing that, while publicly advocating and privately, it appears, advocating for top foreign policy prerogatives of the Erdogan government. That part of the story is a really remarkable breach, and it's not even touched by the law here.
Yeah, it's beyond credulity to think that Mike Flynn didn't understand that what he was doing was wrong, whether it was being an unregistered foreign agent or whether it was talking to the Russians and undermining, I think, the transition principles that really are in place when it goes from one administration to the other. And so, the honorable thing for Mike to do, and I served as director of CIA when Mike was the director of DIA, and so I worked alongside him. The honorable thing would have been for him to confess to his guilt and to take his punishment. And maybe at some point in the future, a sentence would have been commuted or whatever. But the way this has been done, the way that Mike, unfortunately, has tried to, avoid these charges and avoid responsibility that he really should take, again, as a former very, very senior member of the U.S. Army, as well as a national security advisor. This just sends a very, very bad signal, not only to Americans, but also to folks around the globe, that this type of activity and behavior is taking place in our government in 2020.
What do you think about this window we're in right now? The period of time now where there's, constitutionally, there's a gap between Election Day and the swearing in of a new president. We have one president at a time. Donald Trump is the president of the United States until January 20th. And clearly he's been unconstrained all along, but would seem to be even more unconstrained now.
I served in government during several transitions of one administration to the other. I never had a worry that something was happening on the part of the outgoing president that really was going to hurt the incoming administration. But clearly, we have somebody who has acted very abnormally over the last 4 years in Donald Trump. And the fact that he is a very lame duck now and has basically less than 2 months left in position of the presidency, who knows what he might decide to do in addition to handing out pardons like cookies, what he might decide to do on the home front as far as either maybe politicizing the U.S. military. I'm still rather concerned about why he decided to move Mark Esper and other senior Pentagon officials. Was it just so that he could draw down in Iraq and Afghanistan, or does he have something else up his sleeve that he may decide to do with the U.S. military, including, hopefully not, but some type of military adventure overseas? So this is not surprising that Donald Trump is going down this road. What I find appalling is the fact that we have the members of the Republican Party in Congress that continue to turn a blind eye to these types of activities.
When you think about the Michael Flynn you knew, it's striking to me as we were watching, Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani the other day in that press conference. I mean, these are people who don't have insubstantial resumes. I mean, they both have very august ones, as did Michael Flynn. I mean, he was highly respected. He was the head of DIA. He ended up getting essentially fired, which I think really angered him. I think partly because of his management. Do you have a theory when you look at someone like him that you work with, that you know, and look at his trajectory subsequently?
No, I mean, Mike was always a headstrong individual, and he was convinced of the rightness of his views. But I don't know what it is that leads individuals to go astray. I mean, I've had discussions with many FBI officers, agents over the years, and looking at individuals, whether it be in business, finance, or government, who have led stellar lives up until a point where they decide to take that fork in the road that skirts the law and violates the principles and the ethics and the values that they may have lived by before. And so I think this is something that really has been, in fact, enhanced as a result of Donald Trump being in the White House, that too many individuals forget the responsibilities they have as government officials, as U.S. citizens, to honor the law, to honor honesty and integrity. And there's just, I think there needs to be a look back on what has happened now in the last several years as a result of this presidency and the corrosive effect it has had on what I think really needs to be embedded in our government, which is the trust that the American people can have in the people who are carrying out these very solemn and sacred responsibilities.